Welcome to this software primer. In this video I am going to be discussing Adobe Illustrator, which is a very powerful vector drawing and editing piece of software that's part of the Adobe Creative Suite. It's designed to be used in concert with the other Adobe programs such as Photoshop and InDesign, but there is also a very helpful workflow from Rhinoceros to Adobe Illustrator, which is primarily what I'm going to be discussing in this video. So to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and open another instance of Rhino, which I have running right now on my computer. I have a drawing which I've completed in the 2D top view of my Rhino workspace. It is a very simple plan and 4 elevations, as well as a 2-point perspective, which I have constructed in the top view. And the workflow that I'm going to be discussing today is exporting line work from Rhino to Illustrator and using Illustrator to add line weights and a little bit of more character to this drawing to help it read more clearly. As you're probably aware by now, Rhinoceros has 3D modeling capabilities, but Adobe Illustrator is a 2D drawing and vector editing software, so we are going to always want to export information from the top view in Rhino, and Adobe Illustrator is going to want to receive line work. So for the purposes of exporting from Rhino, you should focus on capturing line work rather than surfaces or 3D elements, as they will not come through correctly. So to begin with, I'm going to draw a left crossing window in Rhino and select all of the geometry that I want to export. I'm going to go up to my File menu, drop down, and say Export Selected. I'm going to export just to my desktop for now. It's important to select a specific type to export. Rhino by default allows you to export to Adobe Illustrator .ai format, but I've actually been having a little bit of difficulty on my computer. In theory, it should work just fine if you export to Illustrator, but I've been having a little bit of difficulty, and some testing has revealed to me that DXF is the best format for me right now. So if you have any difficulty with the AI format, you may try a .dwg or a .dxf. These are Autodesk AutoCAD formats, but they're also interchangeable. They're vector drawing formats, so Rhino can read them, as can Adobe Illustrator. So I'm going to choose a DXF, or a drawing exchange file format. DXF is a file format that was designed to be shared between different pieces of software, so it should be especially appropriate for this exercise. I'm just going to title this example for now and export it to my desktop. So I'm exporting line work as a .dxf file. I'm going to just say OK to this export scheme, and now I'm going to switch back to Adobe Illustrator. So now that I've got my drawing exported, it's time to get our Illustrator workspace set up. So I'm going to, using my File menu, navigate to File, New, to create a new document. And I'm going to get this new document dialog. If you are working in the Adobe Creative Cloud version of Illustrator, this may look slightly different, but all of the options should fundamentally be the same. This is Adobe Illustrator from Creative Suite 6, so again, it may look slightly different, but the functionality is largely the same. We have the opportunity to name our file. So off the bat, I'm going to go ahead and name it Example. The first option that we'll see here is to decide how many artboards we want in our document. And an artboard in Illustrator is essentially the equivalent of a canvas in Photoshop. We could think of it as sort of the page that we're working on. And I know ahead of time that I want to set up 2 pages, one that has my plan and my elevations, and another one that has my constructed 2-point perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I want 2 artboards. The spacing, this lets us know how far Illustrator is going to place the artboards from each other, how much space is going to be between them. 6 inches sounds reasonable to me, so I'm going to say that that's okay. I want this to be 11 by 17, but we could also choose another paper size. We have our European paper sizes down here, which we're probably not going to use very often. Letter would be 8.5 by 11, or tabloid 17 by 11 is what I want. I'm going to choose a landscape orientation here. We could also choose portrait if we preferred, and I want to make sure that my units are set to inches. Bleed, we are most of the time not going to play with this. This is for pre-press, essentially. If we were to add a bleed to this, this would create a margin outside of our artboard, so that if we were trying to do a full bleed image, meaning that the color went right to the page, if we had a printer that was capable of printing that, we might add a bleed so that we had a margin so we knew how far to go to, but we don't need to worry about this for our purposes. And since I'm going to assume that we're probably, you may not have these options to begin with, so if you don't see anything about resolution, you may have to expand another panel called Advanced. Since I'm going to assume that we are working towards print eventually, I'm going to select CMYK as my color mode, and 300 ppi, also sometimes called DPI. 300 is always going to be our default because it is the lowest resolution that we should be using for high quality printing. So now that we've got our number of artboards set up, we've got our page size, we've got our units, orientation, color mode, and what Adobe calls raster effects, which is really resolution, I'm going to click OK, and it's going to bring us to the actual Illustrator workspace. So just to go over quickly some basics, zooming and panning work just the same as Adobe Photoshop and Adobe InDesign. One of the nice things about this suite of software is that if you learn the shortcuts for one, you know it for all of them. If I hold Alt on my keyboard and use the scroll wheel on my mouse, I can zoom in and out. Scrolling up and down scrolls up and down in the document in the workspace. If I hold Control and scroll up and down, it will allow me to move left to right. Or if I want to control this with my mouse in a different way, I can hold Spacebar, and it's going to give me the hand icon, and when I click and drag, it's going to allow me to pan around. So those are some great shortcuts to very quickly and easily navigate your document. If I hold Control on my keyboard and hit the number 0, it's going to maximize whichever artboard is currently selected. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see both of them. Let's see here. So now we want to add some tools to our workspace. So I'm going to come up here to View. I'm going to make sure that my rulers are visible. If I go to View, Rulers, Show Rulers, I can turn these on. Now I'm also going to come to my Windows drop down here. Similar to InDesign, there are a number of workspaces that are available to us right away. So if you want to explore what these different workspaces have contained in them, this is a set of tool palettes that will come up depending on which one you have selected. It appears as though I had typography selected last. I could reset it with this button, and it would populate my workspace with a bunch of different tool palettes. This one over here on the left is the main tool palette. And I believe that, yes, that's here at the top of the window. You'll see that Tools is checked. So if by any chance you don't have your tools visible, you want to make sure that that is checked. You also want to make sure that Control is checked. That's this ribbon of tools up here at the top. Those are very, very helpful. You're probably going to want to have your color palette, your color tool palette called up, as well as swatches. Swatches are sort of a quick collection of colors and gradients that we're using in our document. Color allows us to create new swatches. You may also want to add the gradient tool palette. We're going to talk about gradients in this tutorial. As with the other Adobe Suite software, we can dock this by sort of hovering over different locations until we get this blue bar letting us know that it's going to dock. I see stroke was also contained in that set of options. I'm going to say that stroke is something that we want to have activated and available to us, so I'm also going to put that over here on the side. I'm going to dock it. As with the other pieces of Adobe software, if we want to move things around, we can always pop them out as a flyout, dock them on the side here. If you prefer, you can dock them on the bottom, I believe, or on the other side. I like to keep my tool palettes or all my palettes on the right, except for my basic tools, which I keep on the left. So we have our controls up here, we have our tools on the left, we have colors, gradients, swatches. We also probably want to have our layers available. My layers are active by default. I've actually got some extra tools here that I don't think I'm going to be using this exercise, so I'm going to clean up my tools a little bit and remove a few of these. I don't think I need color guide. I do want swatches. I don't think I need character styles or paragraph styles. and I do want my artboards as well. So you'll explore on your own and see what is available to you in Illustrator, but these are sort of the most basic tools that I recommend starting with. I'm going to clean up a little bit more of this. What is this one here? Okay, so I think that we've got a pretty good workspace going on here. So in addition to the rulers, which I turned on to begin with, these work just like in InDesign. We can click and drag on them to get a guide on our document. If we want to select the guide, it is an editable object, which I can delete by hitting the delete key on my keyboard. It may happen that you are dragging guides or attempting to drag guides onto your canvas, or excuse me, your artboard, and they are not visible. You would come to View, Show Guides. Sometimes they may be hidden, so if you are not seeing your guides, you can go to View, Guides, and select Show Guides. There's also a shortcut on your keyboard. You can hold Control and hit the colon key to turn them on and off. Right next to the colon key, you have your apostrophe on your keyboard. You could also turn on and off the document grid, and you'll notice that if we look at our ruler, you'll notice that this grid corresponds to the units that our document is set to. So here we have 1 tick on the grid for each 1/8 of an inch. You can see that this is 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, and then this slightly more bold grid line is the 1 inch. And that grid is going to scale according to the level of zooming that we are at, the level of subdivisions. So if we were to zoom in really far, they would go down to, I believe, it appears as though 1/8 inch is the smallest they will get, but they will decrease in size to accommodate the grid. Yes, here you'll see now that they've gone down to, I believe that's 1/4 inch, and if we went on even further, now they are 1/2 an inch increments. Okay, so we can turn on and off our grid using our keyboard shortcuts. I believe that that's also available to us under the View menu. View, let's see here, Show Grid, yes, Control apostrophe or View, Show and Hide Grid. So those are the basics of the workspace in Adobe Illustrator. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Adobe Illustrator is primarily a vector drawing and editing software. One of the tools that is available to you to draw natively in Illustrator is the pen tool here. The pen tool is a little bit funny, takes a little getting used to, but it's actually very powerful and very flexible. So if I select this, if I hover over it, it will tell me that the shortcut on the keyboard is the letter P, or I can simply click on it. The first thing I'm going to want to do is to select a color to be drawing in. So if I look up here, I have these 2 colors available to me in my controls. The one on the left is considered the fill color, and the one on the right is considered the stroke color. So you could think of these as fill is essentially coloring something in as if it were a coloring book, whereas a stroke is the color of the pen itself. So that's the one that we're going to want to affect for this particular demonstration. I'm going to click on this, and it rolls out all the swatches that are currently in my document. I'm going to start with just black. You'll notice that we also have these other options up here. I can tell it the weight of the pen, I can tell it the profile, I can tell it the type of brush we want to use. You should explore what these different options do as you get more familiar with Illustrator. Let me also get rid of this guide, just clean up my workspace a little bit. Oh, it appears as though my guide is locked. If this happens to you, I believe that there is an option here, yes, under View, Guides. You'll notice that this has become checked by accident, Lock Guides. If I uncheck this, I can then delete my guide and get rid of it. So if your guides are not functioning as you would expect them to, that's an option you can check. So again, I'm going to activate my pen tool. I'm going to select black for my stroke color. And if I just start clicking in the document, this should remind you a little bit of drawing a polyline in Rhino, where this is going to just continue ad infinitum. It's going to draw until we are ready to be done with the command, at which time we would select another tool. I like to go back to the selection tool, and you'll notice that we can now select with our selection tool this entire line, and we can move it around. If we zoom in, you'll notice that it's nice and smooth because it's a vector line drawing. So if I were to start drawing again with the pen tool, if we don't want this to be just a polyline character, if we wanted it to have some curves, for example, if I click and hold while I am drawing a point, Illustrator is going to draw a point tangent to this this extension, or essentially what I'm defining here is the tangent of the line, meaning a tangent is a geometric term, meaning that the line will become parallel to this tangent when it passes through that point. So if I click down here again, you'll notice that it is indeed parallel to this handle that we've drawn here, but it's going to revert to its polyline behavior unless I continue to click and drag. So again, when I'm done with that, I'm going to go back to my selection tool, and you'll notice that the selection tool wants to select the entire line as one thing. So another thing that Illustrator has in common with InDesign is that it draws a distinction between a selection and a direct selection. So if I'm using my selection tool, it's going to treat all of my lines as one thing, whereas if I'm using my direct selection tool, you may recall that InDesign thinks of the frames and their content as different things. In Illustrator, it's slightly different. The direct selection tool is going to allow you to select specific points on a path or a line. So if I were to select this point, I could move this around and manipulate it. Illustrator likes to snap to things, so it's going to be inclined to stay on the same path or snap to other points in the drawing. If I come up here to a point that has one of these tangent handles on it, I can also manipulate this handle. If I want it to behave slightly differently, I can change the magnitude of the handle on either side, so the strength of the curve, how strongly it's following that will be manipulated. If I drag this all the way into the point, you'll notice that it's coming to a tangent here and then it's turning a sharp corner. So that's a very straightforward way to manipulate the geometry that we have drawn here in Illustrator natively. I'm going to delete these out of my document. The other aspect of the pen tool that I wanted to discuss is that if we are drawing similar to Rhino, it is possible to make a closed shape. So if I wanted to close this, if I come to the point where I started again, you'll notice that I'm getting a slightly different icon with my pen tool where it has this little circle that appears next to it. And if I click there, it's going to go ahead and close the shape, and it has exited me out of the command automatically without changing tools. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my selection tool. Now, one of the nice things about having a closed shape to work with is that you can add a fill to it. So we talked earlier about the distinction between fills and strokes. If I select this object, Illustrator is telling me that its stroke is black, but if I were to select a fill color for it, let's say I wanted to fill it red, this shape will become filled with red. And this is a vector drawing, so that means that we could scale it up or down infinitely, and it will always be perfectly smooth because it is defined mathematically by those different points that we drew. We could also manipulate it with these transformation tools that should look familiar to you. They're just like Photoshop. We can rotate it, stretch it in any direction. It's very flexible. Again, this is vector drawing, so it can be scaled infinitely within the space of Illustrator. So there is a distinction between a fill and a stroke. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. So as you can imagine, it would be possible to create a full drawing natively in Illustrator, and many people work almost exclusively in Illustrator in lots of fields. But in architecture, we often need to draw with great precision, which Illustrator is not so great for, but Rhino is. So that's the importance of moving between the two pieces of software. So if we zoom out here again, just to remind us that we have these two artboards. If I look at my artboard palette, I could select this one over here, and it's going to highlight it in the artboard palette, letting me know that this one's currently active. Same thing with the first one here. We could name them if we wanted to, but since there's only two, I'm not particularly worried about it. If we double click one, excuse me, it's going to sort of jump us to that artboard as our full screen condition. If I zoom out, you'll see that it jumped us to artboard 1. Same thing with this one. If I double click artboard 2, it jumped me to artboard 2. So that's a fast way to move between the two of them. So I'm ready to import my Rhino drawing and start manipulating it using Illustrator. As I mentioned earlier, I've been having some odd issues with my copy of Illustrator. In theory, you should be able to navigate to File and select Place, and then you would navigate to the place on your hard drive where you had saved your .ai or .dxf file and drop it in. As I mentioned, I've been having a little bit of difficulty with that. This is not going to work for me because one of the most important things about moving between Illustrator and Rhino is we want to preserve the layers in our Rhino drawing, and I've been having difficulty getting my layers to come in. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an alternate method. You should be able to do file place to get your drawing into this document, but if that doesn't work for you, you may have to do what I'm about to do. I'm going to navigate to File, Open, go to where I saved that document. Let's see here, I believe it was example.dxf. I'm going to click Open. And this is an important dialog box here. So by default, Adobe Illustrator wants to keep it at its original size or scale by 100%. I don't recall exactly how large I drew my plan and elevation, but they should be drawn at full size, always in Rhino, meaning if something is 6 feet long or 6 inches long in real life, you always want to draw it at that exact size in Rhino. So to begin with, if you know that you want to put your drawing to a scale, you could input it here, and we should always be working to a scale with orthographic isometric drawings. We never want to just scale things visually. We always want to do it numerically. But I don't know yet how my drawing is going to fit on these pages, so I'm going to bring it in at full size. I'm just going to hit OK. Oh, and one final thing about this dialog. If you are opening a drawing, make sure you do not check Merge Layers, because as I mentioned, it's very important to preserve the layer structure. So I clicked Open, and it jumped me to a new document. Here I have example.dxf, and if I zoom out, I can see that I have all of my Rhino line work here. And you'll notice in my Layers palette that the layers came through just fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste the line work to that other document I was working in. One important thing to do before we do this is you'll see this Layers palette has a drop-down set of options here, and you want to make sure that this option is checked. Paste remembers layers. Illustrator may not have this checked by default, but otherwise it's going to paste everything into the same layer, and that's not going to be helpful to us. So I'm going to draw a window that crosses everything. Make sure I've got everything. Let me zoom out a little bit actually just to make sure I've got this. There we go. I'm going to go to Edit Copy. I could also do Control-C. I'm going to come over here to this other document, do Edit Paste, and you'll notice that they all came in with their layers intact. So we're good so far. I'm going to zoom out just so I can see what I'm doing. So without being too picky about it yet, I can see that this drawing is not going to fit in these pages that I've got laid out here. But as I mentioned, we always want to be drawing to a scale. So just as a starting point, I'm going to guess that maybe 50% of this size would be good. We always want to do it numerically, proportionally, using a number that we're keeping in mind. So if I want to scale this, I can select it. I'm going to select all of my line work, right-click, and I'm going to go to Transform and select Scale. So again, I know that was a lot of steps. Draw a window to select it, right-click with the mouse, Transform, Scale. And you always want to scale uniformly. That means it's going to scale the X and Y the same percentage. And I'm going to scale this to 50%. So now I know that I am drawing at half scale. So always keeping in mind the scale that we're working with. I'm going to click OK. And alright, that actually looks pretty perfect to me. So I'm going to just sort of adjust these a little bit, get them more or less centered on the pages. Yeah, that's good enough for now. So one of the nice things about Illustrator is that, as I mentioned before, it has this grid that's available to us. If we wanted to lay these out nicely, we could select these, and I could adjust it using the grid, but I could also adjust it numerically. So if I turn this off, let's see here. Now I believe that I may have to come up here and select my Align tools. Oh, excuse me. It's not actually what I was looking for. Okay, so I paused my video for just one moment while I gathered my thoughts. Actually, I was right initially to say that the Align tool is what we're looking for. It's just not the align directly. So if we open this panel called Transform, which is also available directly, the Transform palette here. Okay, so when I select this, it's going to let me know that its reference point is the geometric center of it. If I make sure by clicking with my selection tool that I'm working on this artboard, and then select these objects, I could send this to the geometric center of the page using numeric inputs. So since I know that my page is 11 by 17, I know that the Y, 5.5, it's already centered in the Y direction because 5.5 is half of 11, but half of 17 is going to be 8.5. So if I change the X to 8.5, I can be certain that this is in the perfect geometric center of this page. So that's a great way to numerically align things to our artboard. And I'm going to come over here and do the same thing with this panel over here. So 8.5, it looks as though this one was already centered on the X, but it's not centered on the Y. So I'm going to change the Y to be 5.5. So now I have my drawings centered on my artboards. I'm going to actually go ahead and close that panel. And they don't really look like much right now, but you can see that they're laid out nicely and they're ready for me to start working on them. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to start changing the line characteristics of our drawing. So if we come here to our layers, one thing that we could do is we could just select everything. And since Rhino draws at different colors, if we zoom in really far, you'll notice that these things are different shades of gray or red or other colors that we don't necessarily actually want our drawing to be. So I could come in here and just say that I want everything. I did a Control A to select everything. Pardon my zooming. Control A, and I could set everything to have a stroke color of black. And right away that's going to make things a little bit more legible. But one thing it's missing is it's missing sort of a hierarchy of line weights. So I want to work on that to make sure that this drawing is nice and legible. So let's work on the plan drawing. This is probably a good one to start with. So if I want to select, let me organize my layers a little bit. If I click and drag them, I can move them around in space. Let's move this one down. Let's move this one up. Okay, so now I've got them ordered 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got heavy, medium, light, and hidden lines. So if I want to select all of the lines on any given layer, there's this button here at the right side of the layer. If I click this, it's going to target everything on that layer. So I may say that I want to change the weight of all of the lines on my heavy layer to make them a little bit heavier. In the control panel here, we have a stroke weight. Experience has taught me that on an 11 by 17 artboard, 3 points is often a good line weight for something that's meant to be heavy. So I'm going to select 3 for that because that feels graphically kind of nice to me. If I zoom in, that's got a good weight to it. Alright, I'm going to maximize this page with Control 0. Next I'm going to modify my medium lines. So if I select medium, it selects all of my lines that are meant to be on that layer. I'm going to say that maybe I want these medium lines to be 1 point weight. So if I zoom in again, that actually feels pretty good to me. Zoom out. Now I'm going to select all of the lines on my light layer. I'm going to say that I want these to be 0.5 line weight. And again, you'll have to play with these to see what feels right for your project and your drawing. I'm just doing this because I've decided on these line weights ahead of time. I've already gone through this exercise on my own, and I feel that these are appropriate line weights. Because the light lines in this particular drawing are meant to be construction lines, not actual geometry, I might also want to select my light lines and change their stroke color to make them kind of a light gray so that they'll recede a little bit. Yeah, now that's actually really starting to read a little bit more like I want it to. And you'll notice that if I zoom in, similar to with every other piece of Adobe software, the layer order really matters here. So if I were to drag my light lines to the top of the layer stack, you'll notice that that gray line is now passing in front of the other line work, and that's not what I want. I do want it to sit underneath them. So layer order matters, and if you feel as though you need to get a better view at something, you can always change the visibility of them, just as in Photoshop and InDesign, turning them on and off, or even locking them with the padlock here if you don't want them to be visible for a moment. Finally, I need to manipulate the weight of my hidden lines. Actually, I'm going to move my hidden lines above the light lines. I want light to be in the very back. And I want my hidden lines to read the same as my medium lines. So I'm going to select them all, change them all to 1-point weight. And now we're going to access our stroke panel. It's a convention in architectural drawing that if a line is hidden, or if it's behind something else, you may choose to show it as a dashed line. So you'll notice here in my stroke panel, it's giving me a lot of the same options that I have up here in the controls. This is sort of a shortcut to that. But I also have this option to check it and make it a dashed line. And right away, you'll notice it has become a dashed line that is following the same path. I can manipulate the size of the dash and the size of the gap between the dashes. By default, it's 12 points. Let's reduce this a little bit. Let's make it a little bit tighter to 5 points. If I wanted, by default, it's going to produce a gap that's, I believe, 2/3 the size of each of these dashes. But we could say that we want it to be, say we wanted it to be larger than the dash. I could set it to 10. And then you could even make custom patterns, like say you wanted a short dash and then a long dash. You could do that. So this tool is very flexible. It allows you to make all sorts of custom dashed lines. But for now, I'm going to just define the first one as a 5-point dash. And I'm going to make sure that my hidden lines have the same line weight as my medium lines. So here, if I look at this, already I can see that this drawing's kind of starting to come along. It's looking pretty good. Let's jump over to our other artboard and take a look at that one, see how that's coming along. Yeah, this one's also looking pretty good. So you'll notice that this 3D drawing, because I set up my layers carefully in Rhino, it's starting to look pretty convincing already in terms of giving a lot of depth with not a lot of work. So now that we've discussed modifying your line work, if you're in a hurry, this may be all that you want to do in Rhino. It may also be that you want to add a little bit of color to your drawing. So unlike with Photoshop, it is possible to add vectorized fills in Adobe Illustrator using a really clever tool that they have built called the Live Paint tool. You can access it on your keyboard by hitting the K button, or it's also this icon over here that looks like a paint bucket with some squares. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to select some geometry, and then it's going to determine where are the sort of closed boundaries within that geometry and create a series of fills in there. And this will make a little more sense when we actually do it. So to do my first round of live paint, I'm going to turn off my hidden lines, and I'm going to turn off my light lines, my construction lines. I just want my medium and my heavy lines for this. And I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to select these objects. Let's start with this one here. And if I select my live paint bucket, it's going to ask me to make a live paint group. So the first thing I want to do is I want to select a fill color. Let's work in grayscale for this one. So I'm going to choose this gray. And if I click on this face of this object, it's going to fill it with that gray color. And I can keep filling, and it's going to tell me where the closed boundaries are for this. Now let's choose a slightly lighter fill color for the other side of those. I'm going to fill this one and this one. And already you can see when I go back to my selection tool, it has turned this into a group, but it's added this fill that gives a little bit more depth to it. So I could come through the rest of my document and add color in the same fashion. Let's do that here with this one as well. I'm going to say that I'm doing these all in grayscale, and I want them to read. I'm going to use this to help emphasize the depth of the drawing. I'm going to color everything that's closer to me in the darker gray, and everything that's a little bit further away from me in that lighter gray. Going to do the same thing over here, make it a live paint group, remembering which grays I'm using. Yep, so I'm using the 30 and the 60. Alright, and I could go through the plan and do that as well, but let's keep this a little bit shorter as an example by only doing the perspective for this one. So now, you'll notice when I turn on my hidden lines again, they've actually become hidden by this fill that I've created here. We'll deal with that in a minute, but what I want to demonstrate next, you'll notice if I click on this group here. The live paint has turned this whole drawing into one group, and it's put it all onto the heavy layer. So we're going to undo that afterwards. I just want you to be aware that the layer structure matters, and live paint turns things into a single group. So let's see here. Let's illustrate how we might play with our gradient tool to do a slightly different take on this. So up here, the gradient tool should look familiar to, should be similar to gradients in Photoshop. If I click on this rollout here, it's going to give me a series of preset gradients. Or if I, let's see here, if I double click on the fill, excuse me, that's not the option I'm looking for. What I want to do is edit this and make a custom gradient. Actually, I believe it's a little bit simpler than that. So by default, we have some options available to us under gradient. Let's see here. This slider here is similar to Photoshop, where we have our opacity at the top, I believe, and we have our color at the bottom, our color stops. These are the ones we're concerned with. So let's click on this color stop here. There we go. I had to double click on it to get it to pull up. By default, it may be set to a grayscale workspace. If you click the options here, you'll get the other color workspaces that we're more familiar with. So let's say that we want to work with CMYK workspace and do a gradient that goes from cyan on one side to, let's do something really colorful and make this magenta on the other side. So we've got this cyan to magenta gradient. I want to open up my swatches. This is an important step here. If we have a gradient that we want to save, we need to click and drag from the gradient palette onto the swatches palette. And you'll notice that I get this orange border indicating that it's going to add that swatch. You'll see that it appeared right here. So now that's available to me as a possible swatch. And since we were playing with shading as a technique for illustrating what's closer and what's further from us, I'm going to make a second gradient using this same color palette that's just a little bit darker. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come in here to my gradient slider, double click it, I'm having a little trouble here, and I'm only going to affect the K slider. Let's bring this to say 75%. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm not going to change the color at all. I'm just going to change the K, or the key color value. So now I've got this slightly darker version of the cyan to magenta gradient. So I could come in here again and using my live paint tool, because we have already turned this into a live paint object, you'll notice that that gradient, the same dark one, is stuck to my cursor now, and I can paint these surfaces with that gradient. I could also come in here and select the lighter gradient and paint these side surfaces. I'm going to do the same thing over here just to illustrate. Oops, appears as though that one's the correct color, but this one wants to be the darker one because it's closer to us. And then again, I'm going to do the same thing with this object here. Going to paint the darker one the darker gradient, and the lighter one the lighter gradient. And if we want to go a step further, a cool way that we could make this gradient continuous across the whole object is we have a tool in our tool palettes. It's called the gradient tool. You could be forgiven for thinking that this is for adding a gradient, but it's actually for manipulating the way that the gradient is defined across a series of surfaces. So if you've already defined a gradient or painted a gradient onto something, you can then take your gradient tool and you can come in here and draw a line telling us where we want the gradient to start and where we want it to stop. And you'll notice that it's become a little more continuous across the surfaces of this. So now we have this kind of cool effect here where the gradient is going across the whole object. Let's see here, although that actually affected my lines, my line weights, which is not something I want. So let's come in, let's step backwards for a minute, and we'll return to that at the very end of the tutorial. So now, as I mentioned, the problem with the live paint tool is that these have all become groups. They're no longer functional the way we want them to be with layers. Fortunately, we can do something called expanding the live paint groups. So you'll notice that if I select this with my selection tool, not my direct selection tool, I have this option available to me in the control ribbon up top that says expand. And this is going to convert the live paint groups into individual paths. So they are all going to become individual pieces of geometry. So if I click expand like I did, you'll notice that I could then, take my direct selection tool and I could grab any of these fills and move them out of the live paint group. So they are no longer part of that specifically. Suppose it's actually available with the direct selection tool as well, but I'm going to go ahead and expand all of the live paint groups that I've created so far. Okay, great. And now what I want to do is I want to restore my layer structure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this initial layer that Illustrator gave me to start with, and I'm going to call this live paint. And what I want to do is I want to select by holding shift and clicking all of them. I want to select all of these live paint groups that have now been uncoupled from the geometry they were drawn with, and this works exactly like in design. You'll notice that they're on the heavy layer. It's giving me this little square icon in my layer stack indicating where they currently are. I've selected them all. I can click and drag this down to my live paint layer, and now they are on the live paint layer. So I could turn them on and off, and they are going to be independent of the line work again. So just so we can see what we're doing, let's turn those off for a minute. The next thing we want to do is, if I select this, you'll notice that even though this was originally on both the heavy and the medium layer, it thinks that they're all on the heavy layer now. They were moved on to that layer when I grouped it for live paint. So I can come in here and select one of my medium lines with my direct selection tool, and then up here in my menu bar, if I go to select, I can select same appearance, or I could also select same stroke weight. And what that would do is it would select all of the lines in the document that were given the stroke weight that we want to be our medium stroke weight. So now I'm going to come back to my layer stack and move those onto the medium layer. So now if I click off, you'll notice that I have my medium lines on the medium layer, the heavy lines on the heavy layer, and I have my live paint down here. And fortunately, I also have my hidden lines above the live paint layer, and I also have the light lines above the live paint layer. Let's do one final manipulation to the line work before we play with the gradient. So if I were to select all of my light lines, it may happen that you want something to be on top of something else, but you don't want it to be super present like this currently is. Say we wanted these live lines to be a little bit transparent. There is a transparency option available to us. If we click Window in the menu and we go down to Transparency, it's going to give us this option to change the opacity of objects. We could select all of our light lines and say that we want these to be, let's say that we want them to be 50% opaque. So now they're showing up on top of everything else. Actually, that's still a little bit darker than I want them to be. I'm going to set these to 25%. So now we have just ever so present, very, very faint construction lines that are visible on our drawing. And this is giving us kind of like a nice, very subtle effect. Maybe 25% was too subtle. Let's go back to 50%. I'm very indecisive sometimes with these things, but I think this drawing is coming out pretty nicely. The only thing that we wanted to do is, as we mentioned, I wanted to play with the gradient. So I could select these gradients down here that are available to me and use my gradient tool to define a path for the gradient. And what it's going to do is it's not going to change the specific gradient that's in each of these areas. You'll notice it still has this appearance of being dark and light, but they're all going to work in concert a little bit more nicely now. Again, I could come up here and do the same thing with these if I wanted them to have, that's not the right tool. If I wanted them to have a more uniform appearance there, now the color is transitioning from one to the other a little more nicely. So this is kind of a fun technique for playing with gradients if you feel that this will enhance your drawing. Personally, I like to keep things a little simpler, so I might say that another way to stylize this drawing could be if I were to select all of my light surfaces. Let's revert these to a light gray again, and then let's revert all of the dark surfaces to a dark gray. It's also sometimes helpful to use Illustrator to stylize your drawings. We may say that we wanted to use Illustrator to actually put things on a colored background. And one way that we could do that could be if we came in here and created a rectangle with our rectangle tool, and this is essentially going to create a closed shape. We could do this with the pen tool as well, but I'm going to do it with the rectangle tool for expediency. We could say that we want this to look kind of like an old-fashioned blueprint. So let's come in here to the color palette and define a really dark, deep blue. And now that I've picked it with my eyedropper, it's showed up over here. I'm going to go ahead and open up my, let's see here, I want my swatches. My swatches have gotten lost, so there they are. Now that I have this color that I've defined that I like, it looks pretty nice to me, this dark deep blue. I can drag and drop it onto my swatches, so it's going to be available to me. And I'm going to draw a rectangle that's, let me actually put this on a new layer and put it all the way to the back, because layer order always matters. So I'm going to call this background, and I'm going to make sure that I'm working on this layer. This is currently active, and I could again snap to my artboard. So here now I've got this sort of blueprint-esque background, and I may say that I want my line work to actually be white. So I could come in here and then again I'm going to select multiple layers by holding shift while I click that target button, and then without modifying anything about their stroke type, I could just simply come in here to the stroke color in my controls and change them all to white. And very quickly you'll see that I've kind of succeeded in creating a stylized old school looking blueprint drawing. So Illustrator is obviously very powerful. We can use it to really quickly punch up our Rhino drawings in a way that Rhino is simply not capable of. I mean, Rhino does have capabilities to create line weights and add shading, but they're very unintuitive and they're never going to look quite as nice or as clean as Illustrator. So when you are drawing in Rhino, you should think of this as one of the most straightforward workflows to clean up your drawings if you have line work at the very end. And again, I have this other page that I could probably process similarly. So let's see here. Let me just make my artboards match by bringing this over here as well. There we go. So now we have these two nice blueprint-esque drawings. And now the final thing that we want to do, now that we have set up our Illustrator file with our line weights, we've done a little bit of shading and coloring with live paint. We talked about how to expand the live paint groups and then how to use the selection tools up here to get your layers back again. You're going to want to print. And to print, it's very straightforward with Illustrator. We're going to go to File, Print, just like with any other piece of software. And it's going to call up this dialog box here. So the important things to keep in mind are that you can actually print multiple artboards in one go. I'm going to make sure that I have all artboards selected as my option. For my media size, I want to make sure that I'm selecting the same page size that I've been working on. So I know that's 11 by 17. It's going to auto-rotate them, so I'm going to say that that's okay. It's also giving us a preview here, letting us know what it's going to print in a thumbnail version, so I can advance through this and make sure that looks all right to me. Yeah, that looks pretty good actually. And now finally, under Options, you want to make sure that you have Do Not Scale set up, and you want to make sure that it's aligning to the center and that it's not moving it anywhere off the page. If any of these were set up, like for example, if this was shifting at 5 inches, you'd notice that the page starts to shift. So you want it to be aligned to the center, you want it to be set to 0, 0, and you always want to print all visible and printable layers. And the final thing you want to do is to avoid wasting paper and make sure that you always get a proof of something before you send it to your printer. I'm going to advise that you always print to PDF first. So the driver that I like to use is the one simply called Adobe PDF. If I click on Setup, I can check some of my advanced settings here, but I know that these are set up for my machine. You may want to delve into those menus a little more deeply depending on your workstation. I'm printing all of my artboards, I'm printing all visible layers, I have the right media size, and I'm printing to PDF. I'm going to click Print finally. And it should ask me to specify a file name. I'm going to keep with what I've been calling this and just call it example. Print it to my desktop, and when I click Save, it's going to think for a moment. And now, let me minimize this so we can actually see what we're looking at. It has generated an Adobe Acrobat document with these two pages. And you'll notice that They are set up in that same order that we built the artboards, but they are really, really nice and clean drawings, and these would be suitable for presentation, and they will be 300 ppi or 300 dpi, so they are going to be suitable to print high resolution on any printer you are working on. So that is the fundamental workflow in processing a drawing from Rhino and bring it into Illustrator to create shading and line work. So thank you for watching this video tutorial, and stay tuned for the next software primer.